Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Dini Jalal, and I'm the Associate Director for Editorial at the Hinrich Foundation. Welcome to this Hinrich Foundation webinar on digitalization and how it can foster economic growth, particularly for developing countries and small businesses. There's some skepticism about the digital economy, particularly on whether small businesses can fully benefit from the digital economy compared to the big tech firms. Are small businesses reaping sufficient rewards from the digital economy, and how can governments and international organizations help? I'm thankful to have with us today a panel of experts who can help us answer some of these questions. Let me introduce them to you, and you can read more about our speakers on our website, www.hinrichfoundation.com. Our first speaker today is Deborah Elms, the founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center. Deborah is also president of the Asia Business Trade Association. We have the small business community well represented here. First, welcome to Lao Shi Hor, the CEO of technology firm Elixir. Shi Hor is a strong advocate for the small business community and a recipient of the SCS Fellowship, which recognizes his contribution to Singapore's IT industry. Joining us from Cambodia is Sven Calabout, a seasoned advisor to governments across the Asia Pacific, focusing on trade, digital trade, and e-commerce. Previously, Sven served as a trade advisor for the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, or UNCTAD. Sven is now advising the Ministry of Commerce of Cambodia. And lastly, we have Natasha Bechonner, a senior digital development specialist at the World Bank. Natasha manages a large portfolio of investment projects and technical assistance programs related to digital development in the East Asia and Pacific region. Thank you again to everyone for joining us today. For our audience, let me turn your attention to the Q&A function on the screen. You can send in your questions at any time through this Q&A function. We are grateful if you could keep your questions succinct, brief, and limited to one only. Apologies also, I'm talking very fast because we have a packed program and I have to make way for the presentations. Please note also that this session is being recorded and that the recording and slides will be available on our website next week. Now, I think I've used up my 3 minutes. Let me give the floor to Deborah for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Let me get my screen out 1 second. Here, full screen. Yes, you can see this, yes? Awesome. Okay, so I'm really happy to talk about this paper that we have developed in conjunction with the Hinrich Foundation. This is the last paper of a series that we worked on with them over the last, actually it's been over a year now, to look at how digital trade matters and what are some of the new issues. And we finished the series with one on small businesses and the digital economy. And we did that on purpose because, at the Asian Trade Center out of Singapore, we work on trade all day long. But the reason that we work on trade is not so that some company can sell more toothpaste. We actually work on trade and we work on trade agreements for the express purpose of helping the largest number of people in the largest number of places. And for us, trade, it's not a silver bullet. There isn't one, I'm sad to say, but trade is the easiest, fastest, quickest way for smaller businesses to participate in the global economy. And when they do so, we get stronger economic growth and development. And we particularly get that stronger growth and economic development in often marginalized groups, including women, rural communities, disadvantaged groups of all types. So it's super important in our view to make sure that the benefits of trade, and in particular the benefits of digital trade, go down to the smallest companies in our economies. And so this last paper in the series looks at that in a little more detail. Now you might think, or at least from my perspective, I would say, why do we need to spend so much time on this? Is this not obvious? And the answer is no, it is not obvious. Many people are convinced that digital trade only benefits large platforms, large Western firms in particular. Certain kinds of elites are the only ones who can benefit from digital trade in particular. And in our view, that is a mistaken impression of the benefits of digital trade. And in fact, we think you should invert this the other way around and start thinking much more carefully, particularly from the government policymaking side, about what can governments do to foster and facilitate the connections between small businesses and the digital economy. And I'm delighted to have this panel with me today, in particular Sven out of Cambodia, who can talk about what Cambodia has done, which is always surprising to people who are not in Cambodia, because the level of innovation, interest, activity, and growth and development that is in the small business sector in Cambodia around digital, I think is really a joy to see. And it's, again, why we get out of bed every morning in my staff and I at the Asian Trade Center to do this kind of work. So this particular paper spent some time looking at the backdrop of digital trade and smaller businesses. And it's important to note that small businesses are increasingly online. They were already moving online, of course, and then COVID and the lockdowns that we experienced accelerated that digital and online presence. It's very challenging, though, for small businesses. And in particular, there are some issues that SMEs face, or what we call micro, small, and medium enterprises, MSMEs. Those are companies, and I think that my fellow panelists will talk about the shifting definitions of small. In our view, small is however you choose to define yourself. If you think you're small, we count you as small. Most of our businesses that we work with are in the small and even micro size categories. So they struggle with a number of things. They struggle with payments, because the payments infrastructure that we have in place, to especially cross-border payments, is a nightmare. And many firms will explain to you that they tried to sell something so excited that they got an order overseas and then suddenly couldn't manage the payment processing. And even if they could get around that particular obstacle, the costs were tremendously high. They watched their profits evaporate, and the benefits of trade for them vaporized in an instant. So payments remain a problem. Logistics and shipping costs, which can be high and time consuming for small businesses, is a real issue, especially for small things. You're not shipping, if you're a small business, you're not shipping a 40-foot container. You're just shipping a few things, a small box, a small carton, maybe an envelope. The cost of that can be prohibitive. The cost of marketing, which is falling, but still requires some investment by many firms. And then, of course, access to credit or financing of any kind is a real problem for MSMEs. Development, though, does have a role, digital trade does have a role in promoting development. And so one of the things that we tried to do in this particular paper is to look at the ongoing United Nations efforts to talk about Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Many of the companies will recognize this in slightly different language, but the point is we're all focused now on sustainability, on development, on inclusion, on diversity. And the question that we often get asked is, how does digital trade help with those goals? And in fact, there is a long argument going on that says that development and digital trade is contrary to those goals, particularly for smaller firms. So one of the things we wanted to say is that true? And actually, when you look at the evidence, the more that you take up digital tools, the less inequality we seem to find. There is, of course, a lot of risk in the digital economy, especially around some of the platforms and the way in which some of the platforms operate. But it also provides opportunities to small businesses that they would not otherwise have. It's driven down their costs. It's found new markets for them. They found new suppliers and material sourcing and so forth in ways that I think are important to recognize. So I just want to mention a couple of these development goals. They're on the left here, some important ones like poverty and poverty reduction. One of the ways in which digital trade develops for small businesses adds to the reduction in poverty is that, again, it allows small businesses to become what we often call the micro multinational. So you sitting in your home can actually find customers and suppliers from anywhere in the planet. And that is very important because it gives you access to people who in your own community may or may not buy the services and the goods that you are producing, but in the next community over, and certainly in the next country over, may do so. That's especially important, I would say, in a place like Asia, where we have sometimes limited pools of certain types of consumers. But across all of Asia or all of ASEAN, you can get a lot more of those types of consumers who would be very keen to purchase your services or your goods. It also can help with health issues. It can help with digital education and education in general. We've seen a lot of that development during the COVID period in particular. and helps with work conditions. And particularly as, again, all of us are experiencing, and we're doing this literally remotely online right now, there's more opportunity for you to engage in work in different ways. Now, that doesn't come with no risks, and the paper does go through some of the risks that are potentially there for small businesses, and those do need to be focused on it and mitigated. But one of the things that we really wanted to look at in the paper is the extent to which there are some common misperceptions that hinder the growth of the digital economy for small businesses. And one of them is that the platform economy has crushed small businesses, and that the platform economy has made it impossible for small businesses to compete. And one of the things that we found really striking in this region, in Southeast Asia or Asia Pacific more broadly, is the diversity of platforms that we have available. And so that provides additional opportunities for small businesses to participate in different kinds of platforms. And frankly, there's a platform for almost everything these days. And I think that is to be recognized and then to be encouraged. So platforms in Asia do not necessarily look like platforms elsewhere. There are a lot more competitive opportunities in this region. The second one has to do with a common push to break up platforms. If platforms are dominant and if platforms limit competition, then you should break up platforms. That would lead to better outcomes. And one of the things that we think is important to remember is that many of those platforms support small businesses. So an example that I frequently give is to break up Facebook. Now, you may have different views on Facebook. I'm not here to argue about Facebook, but the point I want to make is almost all of the thousands of small businesses that we've been working with market their goods and their services through Facebook or its associated apps, Instagram, et cetera. If you were to break up Facebook, you're not just affecting that large multinational, which is the target of the complaints, and I understand in many cases why, and they may be very sensible complaints, but the damage will actually be felt significantly by small businesses, especially in some markets where Facebook is the dominant way in which small businesses who are online find customers for their goods and services. So you have to recognize that if you want to do something about large platforms, that there is a knock-on implication and often a catastrophic implication for small businesses that use those platforms. And because we have these platforms available, and I think this is another point that policymakers in particular always miss, you don't have to have the same level of digital skills that you may have needed in the past. You don't have to design a website in order to be a successful micro multinational. You simply need to be able to participate in the digital economy, and in many cases, that is a smartphone and Instagram account. So I think that is useful to remember because it keeps the focus on like, what are the goals that we are actually trying to pursue, and what are the tools that we can use to foster the growth of small businesses. And then you start thinking about, let's think about how they actually operate and what are the obstacles in their current operations, rather than focus on your opening stance, which is platforms are bad. The paper goes into some detail, and I will not do that here because we are a little bit time limited, but the paper does go into some detail in looking at different kinds of policy plans and blueprints around the region to foster and encourage digital trade, all of which I think is very useful. And it shows, in my view, the key importance that many governments in this region have placed on fostering a more effective and efficient digital economy and trying to bring some of those small businesses in. What we would urge above all else is that many of those plans reflect the needs of small businesses more concretely and more carefully, because then you get better plans that foster development in more firms. So let me stop there because we have a very packed agenda, but the paper is available. Here is the QR code, and at the end of this, when you get the slides and everything sent to you, you can also download it there. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you this morning, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks, Deborah, for the presentation and for laying out the challenges and opportunities for small businesses and the digital economy. Let me remind everybody to send in your questions, please, through the Q&A function. Let me introduce Shihor to provide the view of small businesses. You had mentioned earlier that in Singapore, the definition of a small business is different than in developing economies, but are the challenges facing them similar? Thank you, Shihor.
Yeah, just share the slide. Yes, thanks. So, screen. Yeah, as a panel, we had a brief discussion to see with just a line, right? So I brought up this point that in Singapore, there's a so-called definition of small enterprise, and so I'm showing here. You can see the link. So it's talking about $100 thing. So anything less than that qualifies as SME. So it's pretty big size, and you have less than 200 people workers, and again, that's pretty big, and that's changed actually. Before 2011, okay, 50 million fixed. I think a bit more reasonable. Yeah. So just need to take that in mind when we look at any news in Singapore to talk about SMEs. Now, because of that definition, and you can see that in terms of employment from these is really high, right? 99% of employment, 70%, 70% of point employment, but 90% enterprises. And so this really bring a big bunch of companies all under these SME. I think for most of the discussion here, we might be focusing more on the smaller ones. And I think that should really be the focus, because some of the medium ones are big enough to get listed, so they can get. The last slide I have is looking at what kind of challenges. There's no shortage of listing out all the challenges, as you can see right here. Labor, getting sales, we talked about trade just now, supply chain, manpower. If you notice, manpower, supply, labor, or talent, that's the common theme across almost all news that you hear today. But at the same time, I think it's good that companies here, 94%, the last highlighted area, recognize the importance of business transformation. So yes, I can see progress along the way, but it's not without. Yeah, so that's all for me for now, and look forward to all the questions and discussions.
Apologies, I lost my screen for a minute. Thanks, Shihor. And there's an issue with your microphone. You might want to check. In the meantime, let me introduce Sven Calabout again. Sven, you advise the Ministry of Commerce of Cambodia on how to foster digital development with small businesses. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, please? Thank you.
I'm going to share my screen if you don't mind. I hope everyone can see. Well, thank you very much, Dini, and thank you very much, the Hinrich Foundation, for this opportunity to speak. And congratulations on this very good report produced with ATC, which I think is going to be put to good use here in Cambodia. So I have just a few slides just to illustrate some of what we've heard from Shihor or from Deborah on concretely what SME face in terms of challenges to digitalize and to move on marketplaces. Just to give a bit of context, 95% of our businesses in Cambodia are of SMEs. Most of them are informal, they are not registered, so they are invisible basically. And 2 years ago, 93% of workers in Cambodia were employed in the informal sectors. So when we talk about the challenges of SMEs, of businesses, we have to bear in mind that in countries like Cambodia, most SMEs are informal. So how do we reach them, basically? So in terms of the context for the government, we have seen a flurry of policy strategies in the last 3-4 years, focusing on digitalizations, on digital transformation, and on SMEs. I'm just giving here a few examples from the government rectangular strategy, so the government platform, to the Cambodian digital economy and society policy framework, the Cambodia trade strategy, the Cambodia e-commerce strategy. So all these focus on the drive to move from offline to online and to take advantage of the digital transformation globally. So how do we do that? So in terms of context, the government has set this in motion, and if you are an SMEs, you can actually find something for you in all these policies and strategies. However, those need to be implemented. What we've seen in Cambodia is a very rapid growth of the digital activity, digital startup. I think Deborah mentioned that in her introductions, marketplaces, fintechs, logistic providers, pure providers, etc. However, we don't actually see those big platforms that Deborah was mentioning, the Alibaba, Lazada, operating in Cambodia. So most of this rapid development is homegrown and is catering for the domestic audience. And the way to translate this type of context and the type of growth into actually real benefit for businesses is just by acknowledging the growth of the accelerator and incubator system with a focus only on the digital sector. So this has been quite fantastic over the past 4 or 5 years to see so many incubators, accelerators coming and trying to reach SMEs and promote their digitalization, and they're moving from offline to online. However, I mean, this is the nice shiny part of the picture. However, there are a lot of challenges. Some may be common to what Shihor has mentioned, but I would say most of them are not. First of all, I'd like to say that the COVID-19 has had a fantastic impact, and this is one of the silver lining for digitalizations. I think in 2 years, we have gained an e-readiness, digital readiness for businesses and consumers of like worth 5 or 6 years. So that was a formidable accelerator, not only for businesses and consumers to go online, but also to take, to realize how important digital will be even after the pandemic crisis. Some of the challenges, and this I know that we'll talk a lot to Deborah and her team, is that we have to bear in mind when we talk about digitalizations that a lot of what's happening in Cambodia happened on the legal and regulatory scene. It happened because Cambodia has made some commitments, has some obligation in different fora on its e-commerce and broadly speaking digital scene. And you can see here that unfortunately in a lot of different areas, from data protection, data privacy, cybersecurity, electronic transactions, while progress has been made, Cambodia is still in a nascent stage where it's trying to have a fit for purpose legal and regulatory framework for digital. So SMEs need also to have that in mind when they start exploring cross-border solutions, that there might be gaps in the laws and regulation that will allow those businesses to get payment from overseas, to send goods overseas or receive goods overseas from overseas, etc. So in terms of the factors that are influencing the integration of SMEs, and you see here I'm talking about Cambodia, we have seen a lot of different challenges. We're hoping to tackle them, from the lack of digital literacy among businesses, the capability challenges of MSMEs, especially because most of them are informal, the broader development challenges that the Cambodia is having now with the post-COVID, the lack of a common vision for digital, especially among different ministries and between ministries and the private sector, the inadequate cyber law framework, the lack of financial inclusion, and most importantly, the lack of access to finance for businesses, for vendors, also for marketplaces, because when we talk about marketplaces in Cambodia, we don't talk about large marketplaces. We talk about like 200, 300 vendors being onboarded on those marketplaces. And because banks are risk averse, because those businesses are not well known, those businesses have difficulties access to finance to get started. So they get funding from Relative, they get funding from loan sharks, they get funding from MFI, but access to finance for small businesses in the digital process is a big challenge in Cambodia. We have seen, fortunately, a number of government-led and donor-funded initiatives appearing in the past few years. You may be familiar with some of them. To me, there are 4 different ways governments can boost MSME digital transformation. One is scaling up the MSME internal capacity, helping them with formalizations, helping them with digitalizations, getting access to technology support, easing the access to strategic resources for MSMEs themselves. So for instance, we could leverage fintech. We have 35 fintech solutions in Cambodia at the moment. We could see how these can not only benefit the big players, but also the small players. Creating the right business environment for MSME transformations and reducing the fragmentation among different agencies within the government. So those are just like food for thought, and different ministries in Cambodia, like Ministry of Commerce, Science and Technology, Telecom, have started to bring solution, to develop solution. I just have a few here to show you. We have the Cambodia MOC Go for ECAM project, and you can see here in green in that 3-year programs, those components that are specifically meant to get businesses to either formalize or digitalize or to move to establish marketplaces. So for instance, if you look at the first component here, this develop a cross-border e-commerce marketplace. This was launched a few months back. It is actually free of charge for businesses to get access to the first step of digitalizations, even getting access to ICT equipment, and for them to understand the process of moving onto marketplaces. So they will be onboarded on a Cambodian government marketplace, and they will get support in accessing a financial partner, logistic partner, and to do digital marketing. And this is free of charge, this is donor funded. There's also programs on supporting businesses led by women, businesses in provinces. We have an e-readiness and digitalization bootcamp, and we also have access to small grant programs. So this is the type of initiative that may eventually get that 500 to 1,000 SMEs that are formalized or are being formalized through this project are going to start selling online. And not only being online, but the importance is being online and selling online. And it would be a stepping stone for these businesses to move on larger established marketplaces in the region. We also have produced a number of good practice guides in English and Khmer for businesses in the groceries, consumer goods, transportation, and travel, and food service to start their digitalization and their digital journey by moving from offline to online, explaining how to get paid, how to digital marketing, to comply with laws and regulations, to do clean and frictionless delivery, etc. And finally, I would like to mention Khmer SME, which was featured in the report that Hinrich Foundation launched, that is also getting businesses to understand what are the challenges they're going to face and to get them to access providers, business service providers that are going to help them in their digitalization process. And finally, UNDP accelerator programs, because we have to make sure that we talk to the right people who are maybe not literate in English and who are not using the traditional channels to access SMEs. Ways to improve the delivery of all this program, and this might be a way for us to move into the discussion later. We have seen that it's always the same companies that are benefiting from this assistance. So how do we make sure that we not always target the usual suspects? We have to see how we sequence the assistance as firms grow and digitalize. There is no one size fits all. You have to get started somewhere, but then we have to explain how you move from offline to online, on marketplaces, and then sell across borders. We also have to bear in mind special groups, different groups, women-owned businesses, the youth, the informal businesses, and businesses in the provinces, address the challenges of the lack of formalizations, and of course, last but not least, build the government official skills in the startup ecosystem so they understand where the needs are and they can prepare draft policies and laws to that effect. With this, I'd like to thank you for your listening to this presentation today, and I'm happy to take any question later on. Thank you, Dini.
Thank you, Sven. That was very informative and comprehensive, and it also reflects the assignment. I'm from Indonesia, and I see from your presentation there are a lot of initiatives and a lot of excitement about the digital economy, which is the case in Indonesia as well. And maybe the policies, and we can talk about this more about this later, but the policies maybe are not completely in sync with the excitement, but the excitement is definitely there. Let me now turn to Natasha, who is with the World Bank, a former colleague of mine. Development banks advise governments on their digital development policies. In your view, are the policies being formulated with small businesses in mind? Natasha, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dini, and many thanks to the Hinrich Institute for this kind invitation. Let me just say a few words about how the World Bank is supporting digital transformation. And if you like, I'm going to step back a bit and look at the bigger picture in which SMEs, MSMEs also play a critical role. So I'm from the digital development global practice at the World Bank, and we work in more than 100 countries globally on various aspects of digital transformation and helping to achieve a number of the sustainable development goals in that regard. So I'm having a little bit of a technical problem in going down to the next slide on my screen here. Yeah, here we go. So let me step back and highlight where the entry points are for an organization such as the World Bank. It's really focusing on the big picture, the enablers for the digital economy in the region. So looking at Southeast Asia, we have a number of projects and programs supporting digitalization in Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, and I'll talk a little bit about those. But the starting point was really a report that we did a couple of years ago when the digital economy was just starting to take off, to highlight how, although the digital economy in this region has been expanding with improved connectivity, there is still a lot of scope for improvement if key policy constraints can be addressed. And so we focused and sort of framed the discussion on digital economy around a number of key enabling policies. So foremost of that is certainly connectivity and the critical importance of affordable internet. And this is particularly resonant with SMEs and MSMEs because affordability of internet service, particularly in some of the more rural and remote parts, affordability, quality of internet is still a constraint in many parts of the region. Second key area is on the payments infrastructure, digital payment services, digital payments platforms. In many economies of this region, payments are still very much cash-based. The uptake of digital services, e-wallets, fintech, there is certainly scope for improvement, and we've seen that there has been a flourishing in countries such as Cambodia, but a lot of the enabling policy and regulatory framework is still to be developed. And of course, the skills area is very important. How to capture, retain, and stay agile on digital skills to ensure that the demand for digital services can be sustained. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but of course, logistics is a key underpinning for digital economy. And we see many countries in this region still falling short on logistics performance and not yet being able to keep pace with the growing demand for delivery of goods. And that it's particularly, as Deborah mentioned in her presentation, significant for lower value goods across borders. And finally, there's a whole raft of digital policy and regulation that shape the digital economy, everything from cross-border data flows, data protection and privacy, security, consumer protection, and there are various laws, many of which are still under development. So let me just briefly mention some of the programs that the World Bank is supporting in East Asia and the Pacific. And these are really revolving around these foundational elements for the digital economy. So we have a number of programs that support improved connectivity and skills and cybersecurity for governments. We have programs in Mongolia, Indonesia on digital identification, regional connectivity for the Pacific, And then advisory programs supporting digital economy policies and strategies and implementation roadmaps in Vietnam and Laos. And we collaborate closely with a number of other development partners. Both are, financing partners such as the Asian Development Bank or bilaterals, but also in terms of knowledge and dissemination with the governments of Korea, Singapore, Japan, and with regional institutions such as ASEAN and APEC. So this is a quick overview of the size of the investments and the scope of some ongoing engagements on digital economy. You'll see that a number of them are in the Pacific Islands, which is beyond the scope of this region, but this is because we have focused very much on getting the connectivity aspects right. But as connectivity has improved, we are now developing these new large investments on digital transformation in Indonesia, Laos, Philippines, and Vietnam. So I'll stop there because I think we'll have more time for discussion later on. But just to share a few thoughts and also to follow up on the many valuable points raised by colleagues already on SMEs. So digitalization of businesses, building the capability of medium and small enterprises in this region is critically important. And it's also important to evaluate what kind of programs are successful. A lot of governments in this region are moving into the space, setting up investment funds, incubators and accelerators. But again, what are the outcomes and what are the lessons learned? And these are some of the things that are still emerging. So I'll stop there and I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you to all the speakers for their comments. I want to encourage everybody to continue sending in their questions through the chat function. Let me kick off the discussion with the first question, however, and I will ask the question about ASEAN in a minute. But to me, it seems like the challenges facing the digital economy are like a microcosm of development challenges facing private sector development in general. Connectivity, skills, logistics, and policy asymmetries. So how do you address that with those, because those foundational issues cut across the board? Maybe I'll direct it to Debbie and then Natasha. Thank you.
Sure. You're right that it's always challenging to figure out how can you help small businesses grow. That's just a difficult thing to do. So, we have focused in particular now on mentorship programs. So we ran a pilot project last year and we're about to start, heads up for any MSMEs on the call who are interested in this. We're looking for women-owned exporters of goods in Asia. So that will be starting soon. Please watch the Asian Trade Center website for details. How do you help them grow? Well, in running these kinds of projects, really intensive discussions with different kinds of women in different locations, different companies, there are some common challenges. Connectivity is a big one. That's not something that we can do anything about. So connectivity, it's over to you at the World Bank. Please sort that out. But we can deal with things like how do you do better digital marketing, which turns out to be absolutely a critical thing for small businesses. And it can be micro things like how do you take better pictures of your goods so that when they're on a marketplace, they attract attention. How do you think about marketing in general, and how do you engage with marketing companies if you need to do so? There's lots of them, especially in the small business space. What is it that you need to do to make your product more interesting? And then it's the basic things, basic business things like, what is the price that you're going to put on your product? Well, how do you know what your costs are? So there's a whole lot of things that small businesses have to do. And it is a challenge to run a small business anyways, especially if you are a small business and your hope is to be in another market at some point. It's hard. So I think the good news to me about the development challenges for small businesses is the digital economy, in my view, makes it easier than ever for small businesses to participate and get services that they need. Before it was very challenging because you were just, it was you in your village and who's going to help you on that one. Very challenging. But then second for me is the amount of resources that are being developed to support small businesses. So I think what gives me hope in this space is that we have so much activity. And I think you can see it from the World Bank through to what Singapore government is busy doing to what Cambodia is involved in. The focus increasingly is on these smaller businesses and on more, we're not all the way there yet, but more practical solutions to problems that they face. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to have more conversations that are about not what government imagines that a small business might need, not what a large company says that their small businesses need, because they rarely actually talk to their small businesses, but actually talk to the small businesses and not the usual suspects and find out, well, what are their challenges? What is it that they're trying to accomplish? And what are the obstacles in the way? And then what can we do to support solving those particular practical challenges? And they're often the unsexy bits. That's the real challenge in my view. Government loves to do really exciting sorts of things, but often what they really need to do is move goods faster through postal services and make it more affordable. That is not sexy, but that is absolutely critical to a firm being successful in selling their products in the digital space. Any delay is money. No consumer and no other B2B business is going to wait for delays in shipments. So I think it's the unsexy stuff often that's important, plus a little bit of sexy stuff. And the whole combination makes a difference for small businesses.
Natasha, in terms of, is the World Bank delivering the sexy stuff?
I don't know if I could put World Bank and sexy in the same sentence.
But definitely connectivity and infrastructure, if you could maybe shine lights on that.
Sure. Yeah. So the projects and programs that I work on don't involve in working directly with small businesses. The clients of the World Bank, our counterparts, are the governments and shareholders of the institution. So what we try to do, if you like, we're sort of the influencers. We try to be the influencers. And we say, we have dialogue with government. And as we saw from presentations earlier, many governments have very ambitious strategies. They say we want, Indonesia 4.0 or Vietnam 5.0. They want these sort of long-term, digital economy development strategies. And yet the barriers that the small enterprises or even the large enterprises face are a result to a large extent of policies that are either antiquated or as yet non-existent. So what we try to focus on is really the policy environment. We have a number of instruments for doing that. Some involve technical assistance, so advisory support, sharing global good practices with governments. If Laos wants to be the next Singapore, what kind of things, what kind of policies would they need to put in place to do that? So we have a very strong dialogue with many of our partner governments on these enabling and policies. Another vehicle for support might be, for example, investment that's linked to results. So governments, for example, might commit to a program that involves streamlining processes for permits and licenses to build mobile networks. Or infrastructure sharing for fixed networks. And these kinds of regulatory measures will lead to increased investment in internet and improved access to internet services. So we try to combine the policy advice with the selective results-based financing, and in some cases also direct investment in connectivity infrastructure where there's a market gap, or in skills development program, or in trade facilitation programs. So it's really a menu. And then we also have our sister institution, the International Finance Corporation, that works more downstream in the private sector directly. Thank you.
Shihor, there are two questions that I will raise in a minute, but Shihor, I just wanted to ask you, what programs have worked for you for small businesses in Singapore? And you note that, the skills gap here, the gap in digital skills is prominent. And is that being addressed sufficiently by government? Thanks.
Hopefully the mic is better now. Is that so far okay? Okay, great. In fact, I'd sort of comment one point that what I'm hearing is we're making all these digital tools and the systems available. I think Singapore, it's a lot of tools are available. But I think those who have visited Singapore, you realize that we still deal with cash. That's still the preferred way. So yes, there were so many e-payment systems out there, but people are not adopting it. So I think the challenge beyond availability, the next step is how to make sure people adopt it. And to be honest, it took COVID to force a lot of the hawkers, we talk about food hawkers basically, to finally accept electronic payment. So I think that could be another interesting challenge to come along. So I think for Singapore side, one of the counter action I would say that government has done is instead of just encouraging individual companies, which they're doing, they're trying to group companies into their sectors and in fact cluster of sectors, and they put money there, right? If you want to transform together, they give you support for that. I think that has an interesting element in that. Then companies is not going to look at, okay, I can wait, because they realize that everybody else is going to move along. So I think that has added some of the impetus towards that. But then that is where, Dini, your question comes in. Do we even have so many digital experts out there to serve all these companies wanting to go ahead? And well, again, Singapore government is good at coming up with schemes. So they have a scheme called CTO as a service, because they realize that a lot of SMEs don't even have the right talents, right, to understand how to embark on this whole journey. I reserve my comment whether how successful it is so far. I think this is where the availability of the talent, I think in fact, COVID brought a new problem. To some extent, many big companies recognize Singapore as a pretty well managed and safe place. So we had a huge influx of companies coming in. Every other week, I'll see an announcement, we are setting up a headquarters here. We're going to hire 500, 1,000 people, and they're taking away all this talent. So SMEs, sorry, you can try the CTO as a service. As a name implies, it's not a real physical person that is dedicated to you. They kind of, help give you some advice on here and there. No, I think that is now the biggest bottleneck. I think the availability of resources are there, but how do they get started, and how do they know they're on the right track? This is a big one.
Indeed, there's a big problem. Thank you, Shihor. So I'm going to now share the question from our audience, and it's a complicated one. Are there any coordinated efforts from the governments of ASEAN to improve the digitalization of MSMEs in the region? So are there any efforts for not just initiatives, but maybe I'll take it a bit further, any efforts at regulatory harmonization? And I'll address this to Debbie, and Sven, maybe you can talk about, since Cambodia is the chair of ASEAN, what's happening on the ground there. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, ASEAN's been very active in the e-commerce. They call it e-commerce in the trade space rather than digital trade. So they've been very active in e-commerce. And in fact, Sven and I and our teams were extremely busy last year working on the 5-year work plan for ASEAN to implement its e-commerce agreement. So that is an agreement that all of 10 members of ASEAN made to improve their e-commerce and digital trade alignment and policies on a whole range of issues. And many of them are things we've talked about: logistics, payments, data issues, lots of stuff was embedded in that agreement. And then we spent a year working with ASEAN members to talk about how do we move from that agreement to the implementation on the ground, with 5 years worth of activities. of course, it's slightly self-serving, but I think we did a good job in general of coming up with activities that were practical and actionable. And if ASEAN members follow through on that, I think you will get some interesting results on the ground. Many of that we targeted specifically at small businesses, because we recognized in ASEAN, they are the lifeblood of the economy. And if you can't get small businesses to engage on this, then you're in trouble. So ASEAN has that. And because they were so enthusiastic about digital, and this is genuinely true, we had all of the members, all of these agencies domestically, plus the ASEAN infrastructure itself, highly focused on implementation of e-commerce and digital, because they recognize that that really is the future. They are now aiming for a new agreement in 2025 that will upgrade and update existing commitments. So I think, yes, the region as a whole, particularly within ASEAN, understands the importance of digital trade. They understand why it matters. They've taken lots of commitments on board to make it better. What we need to do, though, I would say as a community, is we need to make sure that we hold them accountable to this implementation. Because it's lovely to have a commitment, that's great, but if it doesn't get implemented, then that's not particularly helpful. And so they have pathways and plans to make that integration take place and to make the implementation take place. But as a community, particularly for smaller businesses, to be able to raise their voices and say, we're waiting for this, supposed to happen, where is it? I think would be very helpful. Again, the good news for me, governments get it, they understand, which is unusual. Like before COVID, certainly, it was very challenging to talk about digital trade with governments. They didn't really see why it mattered. Now they get it, and they're enthusiastic about it, and they just need to now figure out how to deliver. And key, again, is what are we delivering that is actually useful for businesses? I think that requires sustained engagement. So any MSME on the call, if you get approached by governments, I would beg you to please try hard to talk to them, because without talking to small businesses, governments are hopeless. I mean, they're not small businesses. They've never been in a small business. They don't know themselves. So they need to hear from voices on the ground. And again, I would say not just the usual suspects, but people who are actually trying to do their business every day. Like, what are your real issues and what are your real opportunities? And then how do we make that better for you?
Sven, would you like to weigh in, please?
Yes, maybe just a couple of thoughts on what Deborah has mentioned. I think one of the beauty of what we did last year on the ASEAN e-commerce agreement work plan is also to try to map out in each of the member states where the countries are in terms of their legal and regulatory framework vis-a-vis all these laws, regulation on cross-border payment, on logistics, on privacy, on cybercrime, where they are vis-a-vis the others. And also, more importantly, where they are vis-a-vis the broader, the global agreement. The WTO is working on an agreement on negotiation on e-commerce. Ourselves as a chapter on e-commerce. So what happened after this agreement was signed and the work plan was approved was that we in the government and in the ministry in Cambodia, first we had to make sure that we understood everything that was in the agreement, and we had to reach out to the private sector, mostly business association, to also try to engage them in a public-private dialogue on what is cybersecurity, what have we committed to, and what does it mean for you businesses to have this in place, and how much time you have to get ready for that. That's easy for when you have the low-hanging fruit that everybody has been talking about, like consumer protections, maybe online IP, payment. But when it comes to much more, I would say, sensitive issues, like, and I'm not going to start Deborah on this, but on localization of computing facilities, on cross-border data flow, you have to really practice what you preach, and you have to explain the government how does this work concretely speaking. What does that mean to have your computer here, your computing facilities here, vis-a-vis having them hosted on the cloud? So there is this basic question that we have to make sure that we sensitize and we demystify, and we make sure that the people who are going to trade, the businesses, understand what is coming. And I would like to comment on this, the work of associations, I mean, in Cambodia, but also, for instance, the Asian Business Trade Associations that Deborah is leading, because they are also bringing the best practices from Singapore, from Malaysia, from Thailand into the less advanced economy in the region. So we know what's coming for these businesses. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have two more questions. We're running short of time, but I think we can get to it. First question to Natasha. Do you think we could narrow digitalization gap across countries? You have experience, you can look at the Pacific economies versus a more developed economy like Singapore or even Indonesia. And then the last question I'd like to ask to Debbie, how about the digitalization of service MSMEs, because they account for a large share of the economy and employ lots of people? Is there data about this group of businesses digitalization? Thank you. Natasha, over to you first.
Thanks, Dini. No, I mean, reducing the digital divide across countries is absolutely critical. And, if you look across ASEAN countries today, about 45%, for example, of the population still does not have adequate internet access, for example. And the countries that are performing less well on internet are, for example, Laos, PDR, Myanmar, large areas of Indonesia, I'm sorry to say, and Philippines, where I live, are still very much on the other side of the digital divide. And it's critically important to reduce that. And the way this can be done is really through a combination of investments, which are badly needed in these unserved parts of the country, but also a number of regulatory reforms. And some of these are not necessarily very controversial. For example, sharing of infrastructure among providers of internet services can save 70 to 80% of the cost of building out new networks. So infrastructure sharing needs to be mainstreamed across the region. Some countries do it, some countries don't, but it really is a low-hanging fruit, if you like, for addressing the digital divide. Then there are other reforms, policy and regulatory reforms around spectrum allocation for mobile networks, open access to backbone networks. So there's a lot on the infrastructure side that can really be done that will have a game-changing effect on uptake of digital as services, and will have the ability to bring new entrants into the market. So as I said, it requires a combination of investment, regulatory reform, and strong political push to advance this. Thank you.
I love the services question, so thank you. And one of the reasons that I love the services question is that it's clear that small businesses are in the services sector, but they often get overlooked because the focus is much more on trade and goods, usually. I guess it's easier to see goods, we know what they are, and we call it in the policy side, we call it e-commerce. So although e-commerce is meant to include services, it really still focuses much too much on trade and goods. And so I think if we can push as hard as we can, we do this all the time. We constantly say services matter. They matter for small businesses. They matter for women's groups. They matter for rural communities. They matter for places like the Pacific Islands, where it is really difficult to do trade and goods if you're a small business, because the logistics costs are never going to be in your favor. So how can we help you engage in trade and services, which you could do digitally, and then you don't have to be near wherever it is that you're providing the service to. You just need to have decent access and skills and some kind of service that's useful. One of the things, so in addition to the just general focus on trade and services, another thing that impedes the delivery of services often that really does need to be fixed is the licensing and qualification requirements that we often find in different markets for delivery of services. So the problem is that often, in order for me to deliver a service in a particular market, I may need to have what's called a local presence, which means I need to have like a business in that market. Well, many of the small businesses in Asia don't even have a local presence in their own market. They are, as Sven mentioned, they're often informal. They don't have a legal representation domestically, so they sure as heck cannot do so in another market. And so these qualifications and licensing requirements to deliver a service cross-border is a real problem, especially in remote areas and so forth. So I think we have to do something to try to encourage governments in particular to look at the services sector and recognize why that matters and why that matters for small businesses, and then start thinking about what can we do to allow greater trade among services firms.
Thank you, Debbie. I agree with you. There should be more focus on services. We've come to an end. Thank you again to all our speakers and to you, the audience, for joining us. I think I have one more minute, but I just wanted to say a special thank you to Deborah Elms, and the Asian Trade Center for the wonderful series of papers on the digital economy. As I noted earlier in the session, the recording of this webinar and the slides will be available next week on our website. I also encourage everyone to visit the Hinrich Foundation website. I'll say it again, www.hinrichfoundation.com, and to please subscribe to our weekly newsletter. And with that, let me close this webinar and wish you all a wonderful day and evening ahead if you're in the United States. We hope to see you again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.